Hello, I'm Lillian and welcome to my office. My presentation is aptly named Staying Gold, Ponyboy, Realism, Melodrama and Coppola's The Outsiders. I will be specifically referring to Coppola's 1983 film and not his 2005 director's cut. My thesis is this. Coppola's adaptation of the 1967 social realist novel The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton transforms the meaning of the text in order to restore what it once did, reshooting realism as Hollywood myth, exposing working-class masculinity as something each era recodifies, and questioning the institutional capture of the novel in the classroom, transformation of meaning and restoration of function. I'll be taking you through both. Allow me to introduce you to the film The Outsiders. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola, Susan Hinton herself co-wrote the screenplay. The cast was a rising teenage star that would define the era of the 1980s youth cinema, looking at Cruise, Swayze and Macchio. The film shows a young teenage boy navigating class differences and juvenile delinquency, with the plot striking faithful to its hypertext, aka the original source text. The fight that ends in a killing, the runaway, the fire, and the newspaper calling Greece's heroes for saving children all remains the same. What changes, however, is how Coppola makes it all look. So Timothy Sharry actually documents how, from 1980s onwards, youth cinema became abundant, and Hollywood offered 6 major approaches which adapted from past genres, juvenile delinquency being one of them. Delinquency films were the rising stars of the 80s youth cinema, despite its controversies in displaying aggressive expressions that teenagers wanted to see on screen. Coppola operated within this booming, well-defined subgenre in a rather interesting way, choosing to film The Outsiders not as a gritty social realism, but as an operatic film. Think Gone with the Wind for teenage viewers. That was Coppola's vision, achieved by utilizing Technicolor skies, an orchestral score, deliberate artificial staging, and rear projection. Coppola mythologized against a genre built on realistic grit, which now brings me to the hypertext. The hypertext. So Susan Hinton published The Outsiders in 1967 when she was still a teenager herself. Narrated by 14-year-old Ponyboy Curtis, he dictates the lives of the working-class greasers and their affluent counterparts, the socials, or socials for short, in the mid-60s of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The novel has been cited as one of the turning points that created modern young adult fiction, with Eric Tribunella being precise about what kind of classic The Outsiders is. A key prototype of the new realist novel for young adults, but also an explicitly didactic one. Didactic meaning designed to teach or instruct. So Hinton wrote within the genre of social realism as a corrective. And in a piece for New York Times Book Review, she argues that the adults who wrote about teenagers from memories or standoffish views left her questioning where reality was in these stories. Dan Shee describes the frustration as the inspiration for her to create a piece of realistic fiction addressing class conflict, gang rivalry, alongside facts of poverty, violence, and addiction. The reality Hinton dictates is post-war, so visible consumer teenage culture, public panic on juvenile delinquency and class division. Hinton demanded reality, but Coppola actually delivers a myth. To understand the gap, I'll take realism from Pam Morris into account. Morris treats realism as a genre made of representation rather than a period, associating it as a rational and secular, aka not religious, form of knowledge that institutes empiric enlightenment, or the belief that we can adequately reproduce both the external world and our responses to it, and that those representations are mutually recognizable between people, with the governing principles being accuracy, adequacy, and truth. So this matters because it makes realism a style with claims attached. So rather than a plain window onto the world, it makes the reality outside of the text shared between writer and reader, which is exactly what Hinton demands regarding where her reality is in the YA. So what is Hinton's style made of? The simplicity of the language Ponyboy uses is vernacular in nature, refusing ornament. Leonard Davies represents this plain style of storytelling as truth-claiming, a language ascertaining kinship, rather than emphasizing rhetoric tropes, metaphors, or figurative flourish. To be clear, Morris explicitly states that the realist novels do not seek to trick readers, but seek to give them pleasure from the recognition of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude meaning the appearance of being truthful. I'm not stating Hinton was dishonest, I'm saying that her transparency was carefully manufactured, which is why the film is important, as Coppola keeps the story and abandons plainness. Look at the church sunrise, where Ponyboy recites Frost to Johnny. Hinton describes it with clouds shifting from grey to pink, and the horizon a thin gold line before the sun clears. It frames gold that's barely there, which is exactly the poem's point. Coppola flips the narrative of the scene, however, by flooding the frame with reds, yellows, and golds against a sky that reads painted, with a dilapidated fence. The film recites "Nothing can stay gold" by Frost beneath a sky quite literally saturated in gold. Hinton's realism promises a reality outside the text. Coppola paints one and stands his actors in front of it. So, the emotional core of the book is Cherry trying to show Ponyboy the difference between greases and socks, about it not being money, but their perceptions of feelings. And Ponyboy clocks it pretty perfectly when he states that the socks don't feel anything and we feel too violently, we being greases. Lydia Wittizen actually argues that this is a period artifact where greases and socks emotions are tied to a specific post-war, mid-century crisis in American masculinity, which is rather unnatural for poor boys, or rich boys. Against that, Ponyboy reflects that Cherry does watch the same sunset he does on his own back steps, which is Morris's premise dramatised. It's a reality outside of them that is mutually recognisable. This happens early before anyone dies, and entirely within Ponyboy's head. Coppola, however, moves this line to the end of the film, into a conversation where Cherry refuses to see Johnny in the hospital. The shot is filmed in the dark, at night, with no visible sunset, kind of exposing the class divide and drawing an impassable line. Scholars are still split on whether the story can see its own contradictions, with Sandra Beals arguing the narrative structure is an invitation to readers to question what classist ideology naturalizes, whereas Tribunella disagrees, arguing that the story undermines its own critique by offering solutions and obstructing inquiry, not prompting it. The story ends where it began, mystifying rather than clarifying, and Coppola does stage this doubt. Dallas Winston. He embodies post-war American masculinity by wrapping his entire identity about being tough. When Johnny dies, his tough exterior breaks, leaving him distraught and unable to cope. And in the novel, when Dally's death is shown quite matter-of-factly and quietly, it's internally narrated by Ponyboy, because as he understood it, Dally wanted to be dead, and Dally always got what he wanted. The film, however, makes Dally's death loud and dramatic, with the greasers yelling that Danny's gun is not loaded at the police. However, the outcome does not change. Dally still dies, but the emotion is vivid and present on the screen in a way only the 80s film can do, something that the novel could not. Melodrama externalizes what realism keeps inside. So, one more thing that this adaptation questions is who actually owns the story. Tribunella argues that the revelation of narrative, being an instructional assignment, ultimately reaffirms a liberal faith in the education system. Pony's response to a traumatic experience is to complete homework, on the implication that he is more of a good citizen and a good student than the other greasers. And this is what kind of makes the novel didactic. And, as if prophetic, this teenage-authored, anti-literary book became one of the most assigned texts to study in American schools. Simone Murray argues adaptation studies have stayed inside the tamely familiar methodology of textual analysis, which leaves a concerning disinterest in how adaptations actually come to fruition, and how institutional and commercial frameworks shape which ones exist at all. So as a result, Murray proposes a different question from how does this adaptation differ from its source, instead opting to ask where did this adaptation begin? So, this is actually applied here. Coppola's adaptation was the result of a school librarian and her students petitioning that he directed it. And Coppola even includes a dedication to the school because they made it happen. So, Coppola does three things, with the second actually being dependent on the first. Firstly, he reinforces the narrative. Same event, same order, same ending. Then he transforms the meaning. His visible artifice exposes Hinton's realist claims as constructed. That transformation is what allows the third theme, restoration. Because what was that novel before the classroom got to it? Fast, emotional, melodramatic and popular, written for teenagers in their register. Coppola hands exactly that back, with a mass-market film made because school children asked, unashamedly sentimental, and he cast it with teen idols. Its transformation of meaning equals restoration of function, which brings the whole intention of the film and of the novel full circle. Finally, Lawrence Levine reminds us that institutionalization happens constantly and challenges our tendencies to see culture on a vertical plane, i.e. through the lens of hierarchy, power and status. And this does include categories we accept as natural and eternal, being fragile, recent and made. So true of cultural hierarchy, true of class and masculinity, and true of that sunrise that Coppola shot beautifully but artificially, that we finally notice someone actually built that mess. Thanks for listening. These are all my cited works. Bye.